Hey there, I'm Joe Weems. Before we get into the video, I want to remind you about ng-conf 2023 happening in Salt Lake City, Utah on June 14th and 15th. Head over to ng-conf.org to check out the speakers, check out the talks, and to get your ticket before they all sell out. We'll see you there.
Hello. So for those who were here earlier, we're just going to skip right to the cloning because internet has not been our friend. So I'm going to pull that slide up, and then we'll go to the introduction and all that fun stuff. But let's skip straight to the cloning. We do have a link up here that is especially for those that are with us online. I know the room is big. We don't necessarily want to shout across the room, although you're welcome to if you have questions. But that is a great way to post questions. That is why I have Michael here with me to help me field those questions and make sure those get answered. So do feel free. Remember that even in the questions, code of conduct still applies as usual. So let me skip straight to the clone. Where's my clone slide? There we go. Let's go ahead and clone that repo. Internet has not been our friend. It has been slow as all get out. But for this one, literally it is a standard Angular 14 application. You will clone npm install and ng-serve, and you're good to go. Everything we will be doing today is going to be in the tests, so I'm hoping that once that it is cloned, that we will, the internet issue will subside a little bit since everything will be working in the unit testing. So go ahead and do that. I'll give you a couple minutes to get that launched, and then we'll go back to actually introducing what we're going to talk about today, which is unit tests. No, it's literally just Angular 14, and we're going to do the unit test right there in Angular using the in-the-box Angular stuff. So it is literally just that. Michael, if you want to post that link in the questions, and that way I can go start. That way if there's lag. All right, let's get back to the beginning. So today we're going to talk about how to do unit tests in forms specifically, because as we have alluded in a couple talks yesterday, who actually loves forms? Oh, we do have a couple people like who hates them and wish they would go away. yeah, that's the truth. There we go. But the reality is they're everywhere, right? I mean, seldom is there an application that doesn't have a form. Even if we look at our standard websites, right? The end all be all is there going to be a form because 9 times out of 10 there's going to be a contact form, right? So even if what we think is a normal standard, like this is my website and here's like, there's going to be some kind of contact me or something like that. So forms are here, they're here to stay, and they're hard. Right? And so one of the things that makes them hard is there's so many things to think about. Do we have the right fields? Do they validate? Because even though we all know that validation on the front end is for UX purposes mostly, that we still need to protect our back end and our databases, right? That front end can't really protect us against anything because you open DevTools and you can bypass it. We still want it for that UX experience, correct? So there's so many things to think about. And then there's accessibility, right? And so you compound all these things and it's really easy to forget something. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a handful of unit tests that we can write, how we can go about making our lives a little bit easier, and how some of the things, and this is not going to be all inclusive because there's 7 ways to Sunday we can test a front end, right? But we're going to look at some of the tests that I found useful when looking at my forms, and that have worked well in terms of helping me keep some sort of sanity and making sure that my forms are working correctly. So I'm Martine Dowden. I currently work for Andromeda Galactic Solutions, and I've been doing a lot of Angular and front-end work for quite some time, coming from a background in psychology and obviously design. So the form we are going to look at today is a contact form. Basically, here are our requirements for the form. And the reason I went ahead and took the time to put up requirements is because it's this. One of the #1 questions I get when asked about forms and about unit testing specifically is, where do I start? What do I test? And so if that's where you are with your unit testing and you're trying to figure out what should I test, I always tell people, go back to your requirements, because your requirements already tell you what's going to be really important about that form, right? It's already a guide to knowing these things must happen. Therefore, these are good candidates for testing because we know somebody took the time to tell me these things needed to be true. Whether they're business logic, whether they're a limitation from the database, whatever the case might be, whatever the reason those requirements exist, they exist for a reason and must be true. Therefore, what we're going to do is going to take these requirements and go ahead and write our unit test based on those requirements. And we're going to hyper-focus on specifically the email form. So here, if we look at, if you've been able to clone, you will see that in the project, there is a contact form component.ts. Everything we're going to do is in that form component. And so in that form component.ts, we have a create form, which is our simple form with our 4 inputs, a name, email, phone, and messages, and some validation. And I go ahead and use a reactive form specifically because I find that it's really nice to be able to have all of that validation in one place, and it makes I find that it makes unit testing easier. So that is why I like to use reactive forms when I want to be able to unit test. So we're going to hyper-focus on the email. And the reason I'm going to hyper-focus on the email is because we have 2 hours. So, in things that we might be testing on the email field, we're going to be testing we could test on other things. It's quite frankly, it's one of the more complex fields in our form. It's required. It should only accept valid email addresses, which means it has a regex involved of some kind. How many of you love regex? How many find regex hard? Yeah, there it is. And so that's one of those places where that could be a very true source of error, is that regex expression. And so we definitely want to be able to test that pattern to make sure that we are accepting everything we need to be accepting and rejecting things that we should be rejecting. We have put an artificial max length. And we are going to make sure that when the field is invalid, we want to make sure to tell the user why it's invalid. It's not just you're wrong and move on. We want to tell them why it's invalid because we want to be able to tell them what they need to do to fix it. So that's why we're going to focus on the email field specifically of this form. All right, how are we doing on cloning? Do we need more time on cloning? We do need more time on cloning. All right. So go ahead and give me kind of a sign of life when cloning is happening, and then we will go and do that. All right. Make sure that you are in Node 14.20 or 16, because this is an Angular 14 project. So you will need to make sure that you have a Node 14.20 or 16. Here, do you want to add my clone is done, and that way people can thumbs it up. We're going to add a my clone is done in that question field and thumbs it up when you've actually successfully cloned. That way I can kind of have a feel for how much time we need on that. All right, while we're cloning, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and kind of walk you through what the application looks like and where we're going to be working. Cool. All right, so when we go into our project, where we're going to be working is right here in this forms component, that's spec. When you're using the Angular CLI and you generate a component, it will automatically come with this spec file. Ignore the commented out stuff at the bottom. That's because I cheat when I present, and so that you don't have to sit there and watch me type. But basically what will happen is we have a couple of dependencies, and I've already added them in, that we need to import. We are dealing with reactive forms. That way we need to make sure that we import reactive forms. We also have material installed, so I went ahead and imported the material. And then we have browser animation module, which we probably don't actually need in this particular test, but I went and imported it anyway. And then we go ahead and mock anything that we need to mock. We're specifically going to work on the form. That's why I went ahead and pre-prepped those for you. What I have found useful, I put them kind of raw in here. What I found useful in other projects, especially if there's a lot of things that I find myself importing absolutely everywhere, is kind of make myself a utility file that I can just import the array of standard imports that are generally going to be things like if you have a material module that you've created because you're dealing with material, or if you have reactive forms, browser animation modules, those are all things that you're going to be tending to import in absolutely every unit test. So that was a good candidate for putting in a utilities file. If you're going to do things about doing standard providers with some standard mocks, kind of be careful what you're going to get into with that, because those standard mocks, if you need to edit them in any way, it's really easy to kind of work yourself into something that's going to be hard to maintain. What I've found is interesting with tests is they very easily become just as complex as your application itself. And so you kind of have to balance, how can I make my life easy, but where is that fine line between it's okay to copy and paste so that I don't build in so much complexity that my unit tests need unit tests, right? So we kind of have to balance that. So what it comes out of the box with is a simple it should create, which basically looks at, does the actual component do the thing and not crash and burn when it's initialized? That's essentially what that test does. And so when we run the tests, we will get something like this. I'm just going to pull out this console right here. And we can just do ng-test. And it will go ahead and run the thing. Please run the thing. Come on. All right. And it will pop open a window, and we get little green dots. Now you will notice that my other components and my other components have passing tests because I went ahead and did all the mocking and importing that was necessary. But you should have, this is what it should look like when you go ahead and run at this particular point in time. We should be started with a clean slate. All right. All right. So when we create our test, there's kind of two basic points we're always going to have at the top. We're going to have an it, and it's going to describe our test. And we're going to have an expect. Those are necessary for our test. If your test does not have an expect, it will not fail. But when you get those little pretty green dots that we just saw, it'll give you a gray dot. And that gray dot, basically, I didn't fail, but I didn't succeed either. However, especially if you're running it like like integration environment, like I was part of a pipeline, since it's not a failure, if it didn't run or if it doesn't have an expect, you might not notice it. So you got to make sure that you have that expect. So the first test that we are going to go ahead and write is we're going to check that our email address, because we said that our email address is required, yes? We want to check that if we pass in a null value, that the field is considered invalid. So let's go ahead and I gave you the solution. Okay, so go ahead and try to see if you can think of how you might approach writing that test. And the whole point is, I'm going to give you the answer here in just a second. But go ahead and see if you can come up with how you would go about approaching that. Beautiful. Beautiful. course didn't look at. You got me? Okay. Can you explain when we should use wait for sync? Async await is deprecated in knowledge, and testing does when and not. Okay, so wait for async. In our particular use case, since we're not dealing with observables, we're not dealing with promises, we're not dealing with pulling data from a service, we essentially don't care. When we're doing things with a wait for async, we're essentially dealing with something that is asynchronous in some way. So if we're dealing with if we maybe have mocked an observable in our unit test and we're wanting to test that if it comes up with a response of X, Y happens, those are going to be some instances where we're going to need that await for async. But in this particular use case, we don't need any of that because we're not waiting on data per se. All right, how do we think, did we come up with a way to approach this? Yes, no? What do we think? Well, here's a solution. Not saying it's the only solution, but it's a very easy solution. Basically, what I go ahead and do is I go and find the email control. I do component form.getEmail, and then I can patch my value. That's the beauty of it being in reactive forms, is I can go ahead and use those things that I use in my component, like patch value, and go ahead and apply them to my unit test. So let's look at how to do that in code. So like every test, I have a it should, right? And here's the stub that I had right there on the slide. So the first thing I need to do is go ahead and find that email control. So I'm just going to say const email control. And so at this point, I want to be able to have access to that form, right? And so in order to have access to the form, I can find over here at the very beginning, and this is created when I did not add this. When you do, in the CLI, when you create a new component, it sets this form up. It already gave me fixture and component. So fixture is going to allow you to have access to things like the DOM, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. And component, like anything that you have as a public entity on your component, so any function or any property that you have public on your component, you can go ahead and have access easily in your test. So since in my component, if I go to my form component, I have this property right here. I have my form, right, at the very top. That calls that create function form that we had just talked about earlier. Well, I can go ahead and say in my test, component dot form, and then I have access to it in the exact same way I have access to my form when I'm usually in my component. So I can say form.get, I want that email input, right? And then I want my email control, I want to patch value. So I'm going to patch it a value of null. And then that is the extent of my test, right? Because I've gone ahead and said, and so if I do that, what will happen is you will think you will get a success. If I run that right now, you'll see that I have a success. The problem with that is that at this point, Zones does not run in unit test the way it usually would in your application. So we actually have to tell the component to go ahead and detect the changes. So right now, since there's in my starter code, when I create the form, I don't give it a value. And here I'm patching null. Those are equivalent, right? So obviously my test is going to pass. But if I were to pass in a value like email@gmail.com or whatever, that is perfectly valid and do that test, it would actually fail because it would say, well, yeah, it wouldn't recognize that a value has been patched. So what we want to go ahead and do is do fixture.detect changes. And at that point now, I have a test that will actually function correctly. And we can see it's going to re-execute. I now have 6 tests, and they all pass. Yes?
Can you
on the high contrast. KT. It is on high contrast, and bump it up one size. Okay. Is that better for people in the back? Yes. Perfect. Okay. All right. What? Okay. Actually, the reason it works is because you're affecting the form component, the actual form object. So you've manipulated form. As soon as you deal with trying to detect a change, a different change. So for example, if you had, if you were to detect that the text in a button, if you had an ng-if in the component and you wanted to check that the text in the button was going to change, then you would have to detect change it because the view would not update. So in this particular case, yes, you're right, it would actually work. Basically, when I'm teaching forms, I tend to people just put that detect changes. It's not the most efficient way. It's going to slow down your tests, but then you're sure that you've got everything legit. And if somebody's struggling with unit tests, I find that it's easier to tell them just put it in there, and that way that's not going to be the thing that's tripping you up. All right. So now that one of what? Why patch value instead of set value? You can use either. And that's where, when I said this is one way you could do this test, that is exactly where we get into this game. Just like anything else in code, it's not, you can patch, you can set, it doesn't really, and for this particular use case, it doesn't make a difference. One of the things that is can get really obnoxious about tests is, let's say you have a very large application and you have been writing unit tests, right? And now you have a suite of like 500 unit tests, and you have that one test that is being a pain in the butt. You don't want to run that entire suite just to debug that one test. So one of the things we can do is, if we have an F before the describe at the top of our test file, or an F before the it at the beginning of our test, that will tell the system to only run either that one describe, which are all the tests inside of the describe, or that one test itself. So now if you have 3 or 4 fits inside of your test, it'll run the 3 or 4, but that allows you to decrease the number of tests that you run, speeds up your ability to debug, and especially since the tests can be randomized, if you're debugging 3 or 4, and now every time you run, the errors, the first error that you see is not related to the file that you're in, that can get obnoxious. This is one easy way to get around that. Just don't forget to turn them off, because it means all of the rest of your tests don't run. So this is a good thing to put in your linting file, for example, to make sure that your tests that fdescribe and fit get flagged, maybe as part of linting, so that they don't actually get committed to your pipelines. Otherwise, your test suite will be running that one file instead of your entire suite, which obviously defeats the purpose of having your tests inside of your pipeline. Yes? Can you make the test fail by putting a string in the patch value? It was still passing for me. We can make the test fail. So because we are testing the validity of the email, what I can do is, if I can pass, let's say, not a valid email, we should fail. Well, right now it says that I'm expecting it to be valid to be false, so that should definitely fail, because that should not be valid. Let's go ahead and try to ping that. It succeeded. Why did it succeed? That is very interesting. View control. Oh yeah, because I need to put a valid email address, because I'm checking that it's not valid. So if we wanted to make that a little bit easier to read, I could say not valid to be true. That would work too. Right, so the way I would make it fail would be to put a legitimately, like a valid email address in here. So email at valid.com, and that should make the test pass, because now we're looking to make sure the test is invalid. There we go. Form contributor required email address has failed. And that is how you would make this test fail. So let's go back to going for our null, just so that y'all can, so we can keep track of what we're doing. All right, so next, we've just checked for null. Let's check for which I actually just demoed, basically. So let's go ahead and write another test for making for checking that the email address, that an invalid email address or invalid value is not valid, right? We want to check that our users are entering some kind of email address that actually resembles that regex pattern that we created, right? In this case, we're checking that that regex pattern is actually legit. So in this case, since we're looking at an invalid, we want some kind of a value that we would expect to be invalid, right? So we're checking that valid is false. So go ahead and give that a try. Why do we need to use optional chaining with email control? Basically, I'm using optional chaining because email control, we don't have types in this form, so when I write the test over here, this form.get, if you look at the return is actually can be null, and so the linting is enforcing that I do some kind of check for it coming back as null, which the easiest way to do that check is to do that optional chaining. All right. What? All right. So this should have been a pretty easy test, right? We essentially did the exact same thing with a different value, right? In this case, I just plugged in user. You could have any other chain of random string that is not anywhere near a valid email in there. So your values may differ. So at this point, we're starting to kind of establish a pattern where we can copy and paste the test, and now we have two tests. Another option is to put both of the expects in the same test, right? So I go ahead, instead of writing two tests, I can say, okay, I want to check all of my invalid values, and I can go ahead and say, I'm going to expect it to be true, and I can keep going. I'm going to say my email control dot patch value some invalid value, and I can expect, I'm just going to copy this line, or not. There we go. And I can expect it to be false again. And so, or to be invalid again. And so we're going to see that that goes ahead and runs and give me successes. The downside to this structure and putting both of them in the same test, putting both of those expects in this expects in the, that's a hard word, to go ahead and put them both in the same test is that the test will fail and will not necessarily, I mean, you can look at the error logs and look at which line failed to tell you which expect failed, but at a glance using maybe like a test report or something, you're not going to be able to tell where in the chain it failed unless you're going to go dig down to those line numbers, which is, so this is a decent way to do step through maybe a multi-step process, for example, and to be able to validate that at each step it works so that you, for debugging purposes, can have an idea of making sure your test is doing the thing. But in terms of a long-term situation, and it's not ideal, and we're still copying and pasting a number of things over and over again. So what are some different options we have to do this? Basically, everything related to putting in values and checking our validity is going to basically follow this pattern, right? I'm going to find the control, I'm going to patch the value, I may or may not detect my changes, we can do it, and then we're going to check if the validity is true or false. So instead of copying and pasting 50 times, one of the other things we can do is go ahead and put them as an array and parameterize our values. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, I'm still going to check that we can validate that email address, but I'm going to do a for each because what is the extension of that file, that spec file? It's still a .ts, yes? So it's still TypeScript, yes? Which means all of our standard JavaScript things still work, yes? So we can totally create an array and for each our test for a set of values. And that way we're not having to copy and paste the same test over and over and over again just to check for different values. So let's go ahead and do that. we do need to parameterize, right? So I'm going to patch value my test value. So at this point, I'm taking the test value, right, for each test, and I can go ahead and make sure that and then the validity is either I'm going to go ahead and pass some valid values, and I'm also going to pass in some invalid values. So I'm checking that the validity is whatever that valid value is in my test suite. Now notice that on the it, I put a parameter there, right, inside of the whatever the it value is because when you're doing your for each, every single time when you look at the output in the console, and when you look at that output over here, Alt tab, if we look at this output, notice that it gives you the test name. I wonder if I can blow this up. There you go. It gives you the test name, right? So when we do that for loop, it's going to give you that same test name over and over and over and over again. So if you have one fail in the middle, good luck based on that output telling which one of those use cases failed. So that's why I put some kind of parameter in the it to tell me which one of those use cases is working, not working, or is problematic. So what I want you all to do is, nope, we're not there yet, is go ahead and think of as many use cases as you can think of might go in here. These in the side over here are all of our requirements for our fields, right? So go ahead and say, I'll give you 10 minutes to think of as many use cases as you can. Wouldn't you need to detect changes again? Because I'm manipulating the form itself, no. If I were to change the thing on the UI, it's that same question. I was doing it earlier. It was unnecessary for me to do earlier because I'm manipulating the object itself. But as soon as I start looking at something where it's affecting the view or the HTML, I would. Or it's being applied somewhere else, I would. Basically, because I'm mutating, the answer is no. What? Oh, in the the link to the slide deck, by the way, is in that and that link up here is all the questions and stuff. The link to the slide deck is in one of those messages. One of the comments is that since the control can be null, you can also do this. Const email control equals component.get email, expect email control to be undefined. Yes, absolutely. That works right up until we try to parameterize and do kind of loops like that. So you would have to separate it out into two different tests if you were going to base it on the current loop that we have out there. But yes, that absolutely works. And so as usual for whether it's unit tests, CSS, or any JavaScript or whatever, there's about 100 different methods. I'm just showing one. Wouldn't it be better to push the loop inside the it? We could put the loop inside of the it, but that gets back to if one of those use cases fails, it would be a lot harder. Actually, at that point, it would be really hard to debug which one fails because the line number for the failure would always be the same. So being able to figure out which one in the loop failed, if for debugging purposes, would become incredibly difficult. But it would absolutely work to put the for loop inside of the it. All right. What did if anybody, go ahead and shout out some options that are some of the ones that you think we should have in there in our use cases. What do we think? Empty string, absolutely, undefined. I'm not going to type them because it's going to take forever if I start typing. So empty string is definitely a good one. What else? All right, you guys are going to have to speak a lot louder. An @ symbol, just a dumb @ symbol, yes. What else? Yes, we can definitely test the length. So with length, what I like to do is check, if I say, so I've set a max length of 25, I like to check a string that has 24, a string that has 25, and then a string that has 26, right, to make sure I cover my both ends. Yes?
Should contain 2 dots in the domain name.
Yeah. Yep. What else? So the dots is a good one, actually, because that one gets forgotten a lot. We can also test things that are non-strings in case we accidentally messed up our type. So we can test things like -1. We can test 0 because truthy falsy is still a thing in JavaScript, right? We can check all of the, so there's a slew of things we can check. Yes. One of the things we can do over here is in the test, there is an option to test for truthy falsy instead of true false, which we will definitely be abusing here in just a little bit. So let's play a little game. I'm going to put up some email addresses, and show of hands, I want you to tell me, is this email address valid or not per the email specification? Not necessarily for what specific email clients actually allow you to do, but per the original email specification, would this email be valid? Show of hands, valid? Invalid? It is actually valid. Slashes are perfectly valid. Now, again, I will reiterate, per the specification, the way it was written, that does not mean that if you go to an email client and you try to use that as your email address, that it's going to let you. But technically speaking, the spec says it's legal. What about this one? We have a space after the slash. Okay, so valid. Raise a show of hands. Invalid. It is absolutely valid. What about this one? We have all sorts of special characters. Valid? Oh, so we think because it has bang, it's not valid. Okay. What else? Invalid. You guys are going to start seeing a pattern here real quick. What about quotes? Do we think we're allowed quotes? Is it valid? Show of hands. Invalid. Some of you are catching on at this point, I think. And last but not least, this one has an equal signs and the slash. What do we think? Valid? Invalid? It is actually valid. Okay, so basically, the point is, the specification does allow for a lot more than the average browser email client actually allows you to use. That's really where I'm getting at with this, which makes email very, very tricky to test for. And the thing with the quotes in an email address are that there are different rules as to which characters are allowed if you're inside versus outside of quotes and whether you're using quotes or not. But the point is, email is actually really, really hard to regex for. There is a reason that some of those regexes are 10 bazillion lines long, and that's part of it. But so where I'm going with this is be careful when you're writing regex for your email addresses in your form specifically, because that is something we see a lot in forms, and based on that, you could be restricting access to users without knowing it. And so that regex and that test of what it is that you are allowing needs to be on point. That QR card and that link links you to that ridiculousness of spec that I was just mentioning that allows you to do ridiculous things. Again, it does not mean that the email clients actually allow you to do all those things, but it does technically mean that on the web, per spec, it's legal. All right, moving on. Yes. Is there a way to just ping the email server with the email to check if the account exists? There are services to do that. There are services that will actually allow you to check that an email address is like valid in terms of that the email account exists. The other option is, I know in Firebase, for example, the account you can require somebody to, they basically sends a link to that email address and they need to click the link to validate that, not only that the email address exists, but that they actually own that account. So that is another option. But there are definitely services that you can pay for that will validate that the email address is actually something that exists in the universe. That would be an expensive test, yes. One of the things that I found difficult is for emails, I mean, I gave you guys, a little bit of time to try to come up with as many scenarios as you could, but that can get really taxing if you're testing very large complex forms or very large forms of data. One of the things I like to use, there's many others up there, this is just the one I personally use, they don't sponsor me in any way, but is Makaru. And because I can give it, there's various different types of data I can ask it for, and it gives me a nice a JSON of that mock data, and I can give it percentages of how many empties and nulls, and so it allows for that null testing as well, and can give me a nice set of, hey, I'm going to just throw a random set of random data at it to see if it'll pass. So that's a nice way to generate some kind of random data, because that can get very, very time-consuming for testing. Question. How would you suggest we dynamically change our it description in our for each so that you know? Okay, yeah, so we can do the easiest way that I have found to dynamically change if you wanted to do like a length number would be to, I'm going to decrease this a little bit. We're going to do that. Now I'm going to actually have to write the test. Actually, I don't have to write the full test, because what I can do is I would go ahead and add, what you could easily do is, because you have the value, if you are specifically looking for the length, you could totally do, so you have your it, I do my, so you have your it, we're going to do it this way. I am testing something. I am in front of people, therefore my fingers don't work. And then I can go ahead and say what my value is. And if we're specifically looking to parameterize length, you have the value available to you. So you can go ahead and do, it's going to be test.value. Test.value. And you can do your test.length. When I'm trying to figure out the length of a string, test.value.length. When I'm trying to figure out the value for the how long, why is this being, oh, it could be null. Yeah, I know it could be null. Okay. So that will go ahead and give you the length of the string so that you know for your own personal reference what that string length is. In the dev tools, this is how I generally approach trying to figure out what the string length is. I will literally, no, I don't want to mess with this one. Do I have a Chrome tab open somewhere? We're going to do it in here. Inspect. I will literally go in here and type into the console, and I will literally type, this is my test value dot length. And that way I can check, and it'll give me my value. And then I can check, that way when I'm creating my test, that's how I can check my value length to make sure, hey, I want a 25 character something. Okay, it's not quite long enough. Fine, I'll add this is my very, 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 very long test value, right? So that's how I generally handle values for the length. And then for the parameterization, you have the test, you have the value, so you can just do a dot length. It looks like we're over-validating things here, isn't it enough to test basics? That's how many forms blocking relay amount from preventing users from submitting the form. Are we over-validating? Possibly. It really depends on, okay, so I used a contact form, and so is that level of, if somebody sends you a junk email address and you can't contact them, okay, fine, yeah, sure. But there are instances where that might be very important to you to have that email address for whatever reason. Or it may be, I'm just showing concepts for a specific, I'm showing concepts more than I am, this is what you should do for all of your contact forms. And I'm using contact form because it's a simple form that people can grasp. All right, let's move on. All right. The next thing we're going to want to look at is the field present in the HTML? Because it's all fun and games to have the field in our create form and to have it there. I want to automatically test, is it showing? So this, I did it as a very simple, we're going to look for it, but this is something you would probably, if you had a field that was dynamically being shown or hidden based upon some user response previously in the form. For example, you know, like they pick other, and so you dynamically show what's the reason for, could be an option. So basically what we're going to do is, right now we don't have that kind of dynamic in this form, but it would be something that you might want to look at doing if whether it was showed or hidden is dynamic. But this is how you might approach looking for a form to make sure it is visible in the HTML. And one of the things we're going to use to do that is look for we're going to be using fixture.debug element. Remember earlier I said we were going to get access to the DOM? So there's two ways we can use this. We can use fixture.debug element.native element, which dumps you directly in the DOM, and then you're doing just node manipulation and DOM manipulation, which is my preferred way of doing it. You can also do it via attribute styles or there's several ways to do it. I'm going with the DOM manipulation raw JavaScript version. There are other solutions, but that is the one I'm going to be showing today. So where basically our email address has this structure in our HTML. We have a div inside of which we have a label, an input, and then whatever errors that we want to display to our user. And so what we need to do is figure out how can we validate that this input actually is in our HTML. So let's go ahead and write a test for that. I'll give you a couple minutes to try to hack it out. Hint, you're going to need that. We're going to be using that DOM manipulation I just talked about, fixture debug element, and we're going to specifically looking for query selector. So that gives you kind of a hint on where to go with this. But see if you can come up with something. You can get moving a little bit faster. Okay. Nothing new? Okay. Oh, yeah. Yes. For those who are getting hungry, lunch is open till 2. You will get to eat, I promise. I won't keep you that long. All right. How did we do? Here is one of the options that we can do. Basically, this is where fixture is going to come into play. Remember earlier we talked about component versus fixture at the very top of our test that is automatically generated. And so over here we're going to use fixture debug element, and I'm hitting native element, and I'm doing query selector. And I'm looking specifically for form control name email. And the reason I'm doing it that way is because that form control name that we put in when we're doing reactive forms to link up our reactive forms perfectly comes through in the HTML. So we can totally use it to go ahead and target a specific input or a specific element based on that. I actually could have removed the input entirely and just used the 2 brackets form control name equals email, and I would have had that one for sure. Now I'm wanting to validate as well that it's an input field, but it's standard, the same. And so with query selector, you're using the same type of selectors you would be using in CSS. So any selector you might use to select a specific element in CSS, you can use in query selector. The thing is with query selectors, if you have 2 or 3 or more elements that you are selecting for, so let's say I looked for input. We have 3 different inputs on our field, right? It would find the first one and stop. So if you're doing a query selector, if you have to be specific enough to find the specific one you want, because it's going to find the first one of that type, and that's what it's going to return. There is a different one called query selector all that will return the node list of all of the available elements that match whatever you put in the select. So make sure we're using those appropriately. Now, and we'll do another example with query selector all here in just a minute. So here I'm just basically looking for the control, and that's where I'm going to be using is truthy, right? At this point, I am banking on that truthy, faulty thing that JavaScript has. I don't really care what the value of the node is. I found my element. I know it's the element I want. I just want to validate that it's there. Because if it wasn't there, it'd return undefined, right? So at this point, I know truthy is good enough to tell me the element is there. So let's go ahead and try to figure out now, I found my element. Let's go ahead and figure out, okay, if the input inside of my element is invalid, and you can continue in the same test. This is where kind of going through a process makes it kind of easy to just have the various expecs in there. Go ahead and figure out, okay, if I put in an invalid value, is my email, am I showing some kind of error message? Let's go ahead and write and test for that. Keep in mind that in that show error function, it is looking for the error being touched. So in reactive forms, right, we can, in reactive forms, right, we have that concept of touched versus dirty, right? And so I'm establishing what I'm not going to show the error until it has been touched. So this is going to be relevant to where to your test. So kind of keep that in mind. Also, this is because we're dealing with an interaction with the UI and showing and hiding something with an ng-if. This is where that detect changes is going to become important. You will actually need it for sure this time. Give it a little bit longer for that one because there's a couple different places to look. All right, how are we doing? Do we need a couple more minutes? Are we thinking we've... All right. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we've found our email, right? That's the same start we did last time, yeah? We're going to find that email input. And we know that we are looking for the fact that it has been touched. So we want to make sure that when the email, we're going to patch and not a valid email address. I'm looking for that error, right? And I'm going to mark it as touched. And that's when I'm going to detect my changes, because that marking as touched, now it's both invalid and touch, that's when it's going to trigger that UI update, right? So that's when I want to detect my changes. At this point, what I'm going to go do is go find the parent node. We have a div that wraps around our label and input, correct? And so what I want to do in order to find the error associated with my input field is I can just go find the parent and go find any error that is within that parent. So is this a little obtuse for this particular use case? Yes. Could I put an ID inside of the error that says email? Could I put an email in that, an ID on that div that says errors for, email input errors? Absolutely. I just wanted to be able to show that you can do complete DOM manipulation in your tests. The benefit to doing it without using IDs is that maybe that is your input or that form that you're using, or for forms it's a little bit less likely, but if you have reusable components, for example, or pieces in your form, such as you have, maybe you're doing how many, think of a school registration, how many kids you have, and it's going to ask the age and their name, and you might have that 50 times, so you might make that as a component that you paste 50 times. then you'd have that ID in there 50 times, yeah? So you got to be careful where you're with IDs, because in HTML, only one ID can have, you can only have that one, that ID can only exist once on that page, right? So with components, you got to be careful with that. So I tend to shy away from IDs in my forms for that reason. So there's about 7 ways to Sunday to do this. I just wanted to show that you can totally do some very intricate DOM manipulation and be perfectly fine, and then go ahead and find your errors. At this point, what I'm doing is in that div, I'm looking that my error length is equal to 1. I'm showing that I have more than one something showing. Does that make sense? Cool. All right. And so then I can also detect, because I put in the beginning of my, if you look at the form component, you'll see that I have an error, like my messages are in that nice little object. I can also then go ahead and check that error against that error in the object to make sure those patterns match, to make sure that I'm getting the correct error based on what they are. Okay. What's your opinion on using data test attributes for targeting elements in test rather than... I actually like that. I like that a lot, to using data tests as an attribute, because it does 2 things. One, it doesn't clutter up your IDs or your classes or anything like that. And it is very explicit that it is for testing, which means the UI dev that comes later and says, we don't need this attribute, yoink, doesn't break all the testing. So because you wouldn't want a change in functionality to where an ID being removed or changed, or a change in styling where a class name might be removed or changed to affect your test, right? The fact that the input shows up on the screen is completely irrelevant to the fact that it's blue or green. So we don't want those tightly coupled. So I like the concept of using data tests, because it's very accurately, this is for tests. The downside to it that it does add weight to your HTML. So, balance those 2 things out. What is the difference with using fixture native element query selector? Nothing. It's a personal preference. It is I use the native element query selector because I've done the vanilla JavaScript a lot, and so. What is the difference with using fixture? What? No? Okay. So Dennis, I'm not sure what you're asking, so if you want to post a follow-up to your question, that would be great. Because I don't have a difference. What? Oh, it has fixture native element query selector. Okay, that does, the syntax is a little bit different. You'll get to the same place in the same, you'll eventually get to the same place. It's just a syntax difference. That's the difference between native element query selector versus fixture debug element. What if we need to create form after the input values are available? Would you call the ng-on-init in your test? No, I would not call my ng-on-init in my test. The ng-on-init already runs in the test as part of the test. So when, let me find the code. So at the beginning of the test, we have this whole fixture compile component thing. And ng-on-init, nope, that's not where I wanted it. Yes. So over here in this stuff, in this create component, the actual, that ng-on-init runs. So we do not want to run ng-on-init twice. So what we want to do at that point, that's where all the async comes into play in order to wait for data and those sorts of things. But no, we do not want to wait. We do not want to call ng-on-init in our component. If we're doing that, one of 2 things has happened. Either the architecture of how we wrote the code in our component is a little wonky because for some reason ng-on-init's getting called multiple times in the component, which I guess you can do. I don't know about how wise that is. And then there's, or you've got something wonky in your test, but it is definitely already getting called. Doesn't the visibility test just check if the field exists and not the user can see it or not? Yes, correct. It just checks if it exists. It does not actually check that visually a user can actually see it. It could totally have a transparency of 100% on it, and the user would not be able to see it, and you would not be checking for that. Do you prefer searching through the fixture's DOM versus snapshot function? Yeah, you'd see a framework like Just. Are there places where you'd pick one over the other? I personally prefer the DOM, but that is because I live both in regular JavaScript world and in Angular world, and so that is what I use on both sides and am comfortable with. I have not used Just, so I can't give you a comparison between the two. All right. Moving on, because I do want to get you guys able to get to lunch. All right. So altogether, what we did is we went ahead and found our inputs. We patched our value. We marked it as touched, and we detected our changes. That's the big important piece. And then we went and did DOM manipulation to find pieces to do stuff. But that means that you can have some fairly complex scenarios in your tests, but it always comes back to make sure your tests aren't becoming so complex that you're now struggling to maintain your tests. If your tests are becoming too complex and becoming a source of bug themselves, then balance that out. I always prefer to copy and paste a little piece, or to go ahead and make something simpler, or add a data attribute somewhere to make the test simpler if it's going to make it easier to read and easier to maintain. Because the last thing you need is for your tests to be hard to maintain, because if your tests are hard to maintain, they will lag. And you'll end up with things like, why are every last test in this file commented out? Why does it say true equals true at the bottom? Now, these are, let me mention, these are all things I have seen in the wild in my consulting years. I have seen a lot of things, and my favorite was still true equals true, expect true to equal true. That was my favorite. But that's how you end up with, because I don't know, some of you may have this, some companies have code coverage, right? And you have to be able to pass certain code coverage in order to be able to commit your changes. So how do you make the test pass when you have to pass code coverage? True equals true. Bad idea, don't do it. But so in order to make sure your tests are easy, so in order not to end up in that place, make sure your tests are easy to maintain. If your test start becoming a source of headache, then you need to rethink that early, and don't wait for it to become to those kind of drastic measures. I'm going to skip this part. Basically, it's, as always, we could go ahead and parameterize this and make a loop to go ahead and make sure that, and then go and check that all of the errors are there. It's the same idea. You can put the same concept inside of a for loop and make parameters. So these are kind of the important bits. Make sure you have an expect, right? The component and fixture get you to different pieces within your elements based on whether you're looking at being able to address what the UI is doing versus being able to look at the pieces in your component itself. And query selector and query selector all are your friends, and they will help you find things. Yes? We've captured our field implementation of control value accessor in Angular. Expect those to be in reactive form group. Is it possible for unit test to component without building up some sort of form wrapper? I historically, using control value accessor, have had to mock that wrapper. I have only done that. I've only come into having to deal with that once, but I had to go ahead and make a mock for that wrapper and kind of fake it in the test. All right, let's move on to something a little bit different in our testing, because forms, like anything else in our applications, have a lot of accessibility issues that we can run into. So what are so accessibility, I know, has been a hot topic lately, and it is the ability to interact with a product or service and gain the same benefit from the interaction regardless of the device use or capabilities of the users. As a developer, that should freak you out, because I've pretty much told you you need to cater to everything and everyone at all times. Well, we all know that's not actually something that we can actually do as developers, right? That it's never going to happen. We can have that as a pie in the sky all day long. It's not actually going to happen. But what we can do, though, is follow standards, because what the standards do is allow us to get to a point where we are making sure that our stuff is going to work well for as many users as possible. Accessibility is not a corner case. It is about 1/4 of Americans have some form of disability. So if I can count the number of people in this room, right? There's more than 4 of you in this room, therefore, somebody in, more than one person in this room has a disability. So it is not something that we can ignore, and it is not something we should ignore. So what are some barriers? When it comes to forms specifically, what are some barriers that you can think of when it comes to accessibility that we need to make sure we don't flub? Title on the page, good. What else? Contrast, yes. Tab index, that is a very important one in forms. What else? Semantic elements, what else? Yeah, we've already said title. Screen readers, yeah, so that's going to come into how we build it. So one of the big ones that actually gets forgotten is our labels. So let's go ahead and grab your form and run Lighthouse, because I have with accessibility. You can do best practices if you want. Since internet's a little laggy, just go ahead and do accessibility. And you will notice that I have intentionally put an error in there. Because you will find that we don't get 100%. What you will find is that the audit results yell at you about forms having accessible labels. The reason why we need labels is and I poke on this one, but there's about 100 other different things that we need. I wanted to show that these are some tools that we can use to help with accessibility. Labels is just the easy one to remember, because you all saw it. If you look in the HTML, I have labels in there, right? So why is it yelling at me about labels? Well, I have not associated the label with the input in any way, shape, or form. So on this side, I have labels. I have a bag of labels, and on this side, I have a bag of inputs, but I have no way to join what belongs with what. And that's what we need to do. And that's a very common error that you will see in forms, because some of the other things, right, we can sort of think of. This one is kind of nefarious, because you look at your code and you're like, yep, I've got my label, I've got my input, I'm good to go. Well, not really. So what are some ways that we can think? Oh, and this, if we look at the accessibility tree, this is an experimental feature that is enabled, and I don't remember how I enabled it in my Chrome. I think it's under flags. Don't quote me on that. But if you click on it, it'll give you your accessibility tree. And what it does is it'll tell me that I can go ahead and, it says I have a label, right? Because I have label text. But if I hover on the text box, you'll see that it tells me that the ARIA label by is not specified, the ARIA label is not specified, the space holder, nothing about it is specified, right? So basically, it's like giving a blank input field. So how do we fix it? Because everything is pretty much not specified. So it's kind of like, here's a blank field, good luck. It's the guessing game. So there's 2 ways we can fix it. We can do a for an ID, or we can wrap the input inside of the label, because that automatically associates the 2, right? Because they're wrapped. So those are the kind of the 2 ways that you can go ahead and fix that. So go ahead and do those and run Lighthouse again, and you'll see when you look at the output in the DevTools, you'll see that now it tells you from label name, or wrapped label, and then I'll give you the label. So either way, you can look in those DevTools. If you're not sure if you've appropriately associated label with an input, you can go ahead and look at those tools and look for the label line. If that says that there's not specified, then it means you have not. And if it gives you what the label value is, then you're good to go. We has a question. What's the difference between it and fit? It goes as the standard. Fit will, as soon as you have fit, it allows, it's in the unit test, it basically only the ones with an F in front will run. So as soon as you put in a fit, it will go ahead and run that one or any others that have fit in it. And then in order to get the full suite to run again, you'll have to remove all of the fits to be back to being its. It's a way to segregate which tests you want to run on the fly fairly easily. Oh, it's the F stands for focus? Okay. Ooh, I did not know about that one. You can use X to exclude. Right, just like the F. Yeah, so you can add, so the X can be added to the describe or to the actual test itself. Cool. All right. So once we fixed our accessibility issues, we're good, except we're not quite done. Because as we mentioned earlier, tab index, right? There's not a real easy way to make sure that you can take a tab and click through the entirety of the form and that those tabs are in the correct order. You can write a test that checks that none of your inputs have like a -1 tab index, for example. That would help you make sure that they're, there. But it doesn't necessarily mean that if you've used a div as an input field for some odd reason, or used a div as a button, you can't tab to that, right? Unless you do a lot of extra work. So just use the correct field and you're good to go. But you want to make sure you can tab through that. So there is a list of manual things you really should be checking with your forms in order to make sure that you're actually accessible. That 100% is great, and it is a great start. But it is important to understand that that 100% is a start, not a one and done. So there's another tool that I like to help, especially with tab index actually, is Accessibility Insights for Web. It's a plugin that you can add to either, there is one for Chrome, Microsoft, and Edge. Chrome, Firefox, and Edge, wow. And so what that will allow you to do is it has 3 different options that you can use. The first one is FastPass, which is pretty much what the equivalent of what Lighthouse does. It runs through a series of automated tests and gets an output. Both of them run the same the same code under the covers. It's both, in both cases, it's Axe. So you're going to get similar results out of both. What is nice about this tool, however, is that it has this tab steps, which will actually visually show you as you tab through what your tab order is, so you can make sure that, one, your tab order is the correct order, and that you can tab to all of the things you should be able to tab to. Firefox actually has this in their dev tools without needing a plugin, so if you're a Firefox user, that's right there in the dev tools as well. And the last one, and goes ahead and shows you again what that list of needs to be done manually. Sometimes color contrast, you will see that it'll want you to do a manual check on that. If you have an image as a background, for example, most automatic color contrast checkers are not good enough to check against an image. You're going to have to look at what the darkest point in that image is and the lightest point in that image is and make sure that your text works well on both of those extremes. So it can become, depending on the image that you have, especially if it's a very busy image with a lot of different colors and a lot of different contrasts, that can become very, very tricky if you're going to put text on top of it. I personally shy away from putting text on top of images because of that exactly. The other thing that it does now, if you are brand new to accessibility, this is a terrible idea. This is not where you start. If it's a great to be aware that this exists. It is a walkthrough. It will walk you through, literally, here are the instructions to do a full-blown audit of your page. So it is good to go through. But if this looks overwhelming, it's because it is a lot of work, it is huge, and do not, if you're new to accessibility and this overwhelms you, just close it, get comfortable with the FastPass, and then come back and look at it. This should not scare you away from accessibility. It is the in-depth, I want to make sure that every last little thing is legit. And eventually, to be accessible, you need to be checking all these things. But if this is not where you are at, just close that, go back to the FastPass, and get comfortable with that, and then move on. And then the last piece is that they can actually, if you want to do a quick check on something specific, like you're specifically working on your colors, or you're specifically working on your landmarks, or landmarks are where your headers and those semantic tags are going to be. It has some quicker ways of doing that. So both of them are perfectly legitimate tools. Here's the QR code and the link for the accessibility insights. I use both kind of interchangeably. It really depends on what I'm doing that day and what and if I'm looking for something specific that day. But for the most part, they're, in terms of quality, they're the same. So let's kind of recap. Accessibility is not a corner case. Don't forget it. It's hard, and you can do a lot automated, but that is not the end-all be-all. There will always be a manual component. Those are kind of the key things you need to remember about accessibility. And here's the 2 tools that we talked about today. If you want to know more about getting started with accessibility, shameless plug, I do have a book. It's available on Amazon. Check it out. Hey, you know what? Come on now. All right. And if you have any questions, I will go ahead and take them. Otherwise, have a great lunch, everybody.